We resume the hearings of the Commission of Inquiry into the occupied Palestine territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. The next witness is Dr. Tatyana Eatwell. And Dr. Eatwell is a barrister who is acting under instructions from the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians on behalf of the family of Shireen Abu Akleh. Dr. Eatwell, we welcome you very much to our hearings this afternoon, based here in Geneva. We realise that you're coming in virtually, I think, from London, but welcome. And I invite you to firstly tell us about who you are and what you're doing, who you're acting for, and then secondly, if you would, the means by which you are seeking accountability on behalf of the family of Ms. Abu Akleh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Sidoti. My name is, as you said, Dr. Tatyana Eatwell. I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers in London and a specialist in public international law and international human rights law. I'm here today in my capacity as International Counsel, together with Jennifer Robinson, also of Doughty Street Chambers, and instructed by Bindman's solicitors for a coalition of organisations, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, or PJS, the International Federation of Journalists, IFJ, and the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, ICJP, and would act on behalf of the family of Shireen Abu Akleh and also on behalf of Ali Samoudi and Tatyana Eatwell and other journalists who I'll be mentioning during my evidence session today, who have been killed or seriously injured as a result of being targeted with lethal force by members of the Israeli armed forces, and who seek accountability, justice and reparation for their harm caused. And the persons I should mention the persons we represent also include the occupants of the Al-Susi, the Al-Sharouk and the Al-Jalal towers that were destroyed as a result of aerial attack in May 2021 by the Israeli Air Force. I should make clear that in this regard, my role is focused on international accountability mechanisms, and I am not instructed or involved in Shireen's family's US-focused efforts to seek accountability. You've heard evidence, I understand, from Ali Samoudi and Tatyana Eatwell, survivors and witnesses of the attack on the 11th of May 2022, in which Shireen was killed. They are best placed, of course, to give an account of the circumstances in which Shireen and Ali were shot, and I do not propose to repeat their evidence or summarise it. But I do propose to discuss the three issues today, which are intimately related and touch on your question, Commissioner, about the steps taken to seek accountability. The first is just a brief summary about following Shireen's killing and the lack of independent and impartial forensic investigation in her case and the consequences that has with respect to ongoing impunity for her killing. Secondly, why Shireen's case is emblematic of the systematic targeting of journalists in Palestine by members of the Israeli armed forces. And then third, the steps taken by the victims, including Shireen's family, at an international level to seek accountability, and the role that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and international accountability mechanisms can and should play in ensuring accountability and justice to victims in these circumstances. So if I may first address the lack of thorough forensic investigation and the resulting impunity in Shireen's case. And in this regard, I'd like to address three main topics. The first being providing a summary of the informal investigations carried out by media and civil society and their findings, and including the findings of the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner's inquiry into Shireen's killing. And then secondly, a summary of the formal but limited investigations that have been conducted by the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli authorities. And thirdly, concerns that we have regarding the independence and impartiality of the internal inquiry conducted by the Israeli Defense Forces. So with respect to the informal investigations by media and civil society, just to give some background, as you know, Shireen Abu Akleh was a veteran journalist. She was a prominent, distinguished reporter and long-term correspondent for Al Jazeera. And her career reporting in Palestine spanned decades. And it's perhaps because of her prominence that her case and the failure by Israel to comply with its international obligations to conduct an independent and impartial forensic investigation has shone a light on the serious threats that Palestinian journalists encounter on a daily basis and the culture of impunity that exists within the Israeli armed forces with respect to human rights violations and crimes committed against Palestinians. Now, Shireen's case has received significant attention from civil society and media organizations that have conducted their own investigations into the circumstances of her killing. These include investigations by the Washington Post, CNN, the New York Times, Associated Press, Bellingcat, B'Tselem, and Forensic Architecture and Al-Haq, and indeed by the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. And in that respect, her case is unusual. In all other matters, in terms of the circumstances in which she's killed, unfortunately, those circumstances have common threads with other incidents of violence committed against Palestinian journalists. Now, these informal investigations were based on video and audio material in the public domain, and in some cases, eyewitness accounts. And the conclusions, including the conclusions of the Office of Human Rights Commissioner, those that are published in the report of 24th of June 2022, support the following conclusions. First, that Shireen and her fellow journalists would have been clearly visible to the Israeli forces stationed down the road from her and was clearly marked as press. Secondly, the shots that were fired at Shireen and hit Shireen in her head and killed her were fired from a distance of approximately 170 to 180 meters away from the direction of the location of the Israeli armed forces. Third, that the shots were fired deliberately. Fourth, that there were no shots fired at or near Shireen's location immediately before the shots were fired towards her, Ali, and Shatha. 5, there was no immediate risk to life to the marksman who fired the shots. And 6, that the shots continued after Shireen was hit and were directed towards Shatha, and also prevented civilians present from providing first aid to Shireen after she was shot. However, these informal investigations by media and civil society are no substitute for a formal forensic, that is criminal, investigation. They are, nevertheless, important as they call into question the results of the internal inquiry conducted by the IDF into the circumstances of Shireen's killing, and also raise serious doubt as to the Israeli authorities' willingness and ability to conduct an independent and impartial investigation into this matter. Now, I've mentioned the IDF internal inquiry. Shireen's case has been, or the circumstances of her killing have been the subject of 2 formal inquiries conducted by the domestic authorities, the Palestinian Authority, and the Israeli authorities. On the 26th of May, the Palestinian Authority's Attorney General released a report, or produced a report, based on eyewitness evidence and the forensic examination of the scene where Shireen was killed. And that concludes that the shots that were fired at Shireen, Ali, and Shatta who would have been clearly identifiable as journalists and civilians, were fired deliberately and from the Israeli forces' position. Feindman's has been in communication with the Palestinian Authority and has requested the detailed findings of the Attorney General, and the Palestinian Authority have been cooperating with us and with the family's search for accountability in that regard. The Attorney General's report concluded that Shireen's death was caused by a laceration to her brain caused by a high-velocity projectile that entered the back left side of her skull and exited the front right side. And moreover, that traces of 5 other projectiles were concentrated and adjacent to each other, were found near a tree located to where Shireen fell. And the forensic investigation concluded that these 5 shots and the fatal shot were fired from the same fixed point. The IDF has conducted an internal inquiry. The summary of the findings of that inquiry were released on the 5th of September 2022, and I will address that inquiry in more detail in due course. However, first I wish to make the point that and it should be made clear that these formal inquiries are limited. First, the Palestinian Authority investigation can only go so far because of a lack of cooperation between the two authorities. That means that the IDF has not provided the Palestinian Authority with access to the firearm or firearms carried by the members of the Israeli forces who are conducting an operation in Jenin camp that day, or access to members of those armed forces for interview. Secondly, the IDF inquiry was internal. It was not an independent forensic investigation. Indeed, the IDF have ruled out submitting its findings in the matter for detailed criminal investigation. And for example, the IDF inquiry didn't follow, as far as we can see, all the avenues for inquiry. It did not include eyewitness evidence, for example, from civilians present at the time, including Ali Samoudi and Shatta and Aisha. Before addressing the IDF internal inquiry, I think it's first important to mention the steps taken by the United States to act as an intermediary between these two domestic authorities. As you will be aware, Shireen Abu Akleh was a US citizen as well as a Palestinian citizen. The United States acted as an intermediary with respect to the examination of the bullet recovered from Shireen that was provided to the United States Embassy by the Palestinian Authority. And the Israeli authorities did not provide the suspected firearm or firearms to the United States Embassy in this regard. The United States released the summary of its findings on the 4th of July, 2022, and the examination of the bullet was overseen by the United States Security Coordinator, and the examination was proven inconclusive. The security coordinator found that the shooting was not intentional, but, and I quote, the result of tragic circumstances of the operation. However, there are 3 principal concerns that arise out of this report. First, the security coordinator has not released any detailed reasons for its finding. Second, without knowing the reasons underlying the security coordinator's conclusion, the specific detail of those, quote, tragic circumstances that the security coordinator is referring to, and the detail of the evidence considered by the security coordinator, it's not possible to conclude that the investigation was thorough, independent and impartial, and indeed transparent, or in any way meets the requirement of investigation under international law. Moreover, the qualifications of the security coordinator are not known and have not been provided, especially with regard to conducting thorough forensic investigations and the analysis of the of the evidence. Again, Bindmans have been in touch with the United States authorities and have requested of the US government the detailed findings that underlie the security coordinator's conclusions. They are yet to receive a response. Now, these requests to the relevant authorities are all part and parcel of the family's efforts to secure accountability for Shireen's killing. And as I will mention later, it should not be left to the families of victims and victims themselves to pursue an investigation and to ask for detailed findings and reasons underlying these findings. Now, with respect to the IDF internal inquiry, and the results of that inquiry, as I mentioned, were released in summary form on the 5th of September of this year, and they are also inconclusive. It appears from the information publicly available that the inquiry failed to pursue all lines of inquiry, as I've mentioned, and focused solely on the evidence of members of the Israeli armed forces involved, if at all. The internal inquiry, in line with the US security coordinator's findings, concluded that first, there was a high possibility that Shireen was accidentally hit by IDF gunfire fired towards suspected Palestinian gunmen during an exchange of fire, or that it was possible that Shireen was hit by shots fired by a Palestinian gunman. And the conclusions of the inquiry are self-contradicting. The inquiry found that it was not possible to identify the shooter, but at the same time could unequivocally conclude that gunfire was not intentionally directed at Shireen, quote, in a manner intended to harm the journalist. Now, if one cannot identify the shooter, it's very difficult to see how one can conclude that the shooter did not intentionally direct fire at Shireen in a manner intended to harm her. Based on the conclusions of the internal inquiry, the Israeli authorities have ruled out the possibility of a criminal investigation into this matter, concluding that, quote, there is no suspicion of a criminal offence that justifies the opening of a military policed investigation. So upon this conclusion, the family really have very little prospect of any form of domestic criminal investigation by the Israeli authorities into Shireen's killing. Now, I'd like to address our concerns regarding the transparency, independence and impartiality of the IDF internal inquiry. First, the IDF has not released any footage or detail or provided any evidential basis for the assertion that there was an exchange of fire between members of the Israeli forces and armed Palestinians located in or near to the place where Shireen was killed immediately before or at the time the fatal shots were fired. Indeed, rather concerningly, in the immediate aftermath of Shireen's killing, at around 7:45 local time, the Israeli Foreign Ministry released footage on Twitter of a Palestinian gunman firing indiscriminately down a narrow alleyway, stating that the gunman was the likely source of fire that hit Shireen. That tweet and the video are still available on Twitter, and that same video footage was released together with the summary, the press release with the summary of the IDF internal inquiry's findings. Now, I referred to investigations by civil society and media. Those investigations and their conclusions wholly undermine the summary findings by the IDF internal inquiry. In fact, investigations first released, the reports by B'Tselem first released, and then later, more recently, on the 3rd of November this year, by Forensic Architecture Al-Haq, as well as the reports of media organizations, CNN and Washington Post, etc., that are the product of detailed video and audio analysis of the incident, demonstrate that there were no other shots fired immediately before or at the time of Shireen's killing, or in Shireen's immediate vicinity, or at the Israeli forces, their present, and that the shots that were directed at Shireen, Ali, and Shatta were not indiscriminate, but individual shots targeted directly at them. And these findings undermine the internal inquiry's conclusions and are considered very important in that regard. Moreover, these investigations, and with respect to the investigations by forensic architecture and Al-Haq, also include the use of 3D modelling and reconstruction of the area where the incidents took place and the location where the Palestinian government, who was in the footage released by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, was located, and demonstrate how the shots that killed Shireen could not have been fired from the location where the Palestinian government was at the time. Indeed, he was on the other side of the IDF position, and down an alleyway. It would not have been possible, even with a ricochet, for a bullet to have travelled that far and to have hit Shireen, or indeed to have 5 of those bullets to have been very well targeted on a tree stump where Shireen was killed. Now, the posting of this footage and statement by the Foreign Ministry on Twitter in moments after Shireen was killed, and without any investigation into the incident, is deeply concerning. And it raises serious questions about the Israeli government's willingness to conduct a thorough, independent and impartial investigation. And there is a real and serious concern that the results of the IDF internal inquiry were a foregone conclusion. This statement and other public statements made by Israeli public officials before the IDF internal inquiry was concluded, and while it was ongoing, put into serious doubt any purported commitment to transparency and independence. Examples of such statements include, on the 26th of May this year, statement by Israel's Defense Minister Benny Gantz, rejecting the assertion that Shireen was fired at intentionally as a blatant lie, and that IDF soldiers, I'm quoting, did not recognize journalists in the area throughout the activity and certainly did not deliberately fire at journalists. On the 22nd of June, the military spokesperson Rang Koshav described the journalists there present as being armed with cameras. On the 4th of July, 2022, 2 months before the findings of the IDF internal investigations were released, Israel's then Prime Minister Yair Lapid stated that the IDF investigation was, quote, unable to determine who is responsible for the tragic death of Shireen Abu Akleh, but it was able to determine conclusively that there was no intention to harm her. This is before the inquiry was concluded. Again, as I mentioned, Bymans, on behalf of Shireen's family, have requested the detailed findings of the IDF inquiry. They have not received any response. Second, I'd like to turn to why Shireen's case is emblematic of the issue of targeting of journalists in Palestine, a wider issue. Shireen's case is not an isolated incident. The tragedy of her killing is one that has been felt and experienced by many journalists and their families in Palestine, who experience the threat of violence every day for doing their work. And these cases are not only about the right to life, but also about freedom of expression, and are emblematic of the systematic attempts to close down the free and independent media space in Palestine, and the creation of a hostile environment for Palestinian journalists working in the region that in turn feeds a culture of impunity within the Israeli armed forces. That hostile environment, as I understand you've heard in evidence to this during these public hearings, includes barriers to gaining accreditation and restrictions on freedom of movement, which are matters of concern for journalists who are represented by the PJS, and which undermines their general ability to work and report and operate in the region, and also includes direct attacks on military attacks on media infrastructure seen during the May 2021 hostilities, and those aerial attacks on the Al-Susi and Al-Jalal towers conducted by the Israeli Air Force. Those towers not only contained the offices of large international media organizations, but also Palestinian media organizations, small local media organizations, and civilian residences. Now, Shireen's case, as I've said, has shone a light on the hostile environment in which Palestinian journalists have been working for many years, and on the culture of impunity within the Israeli armed forces. And I've been working on the issue of targeting of journalists in Palestine since 2020. And in that regard, and acting on behalf of the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate and the International Federation of Journalists and their members, we filed 2 communications to the United Nations Special Procedures, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and the Special Rapporteur on Arbitrary Executions on the 8th of December 2020. And these communications address the use of lethal force by members of the Israeli armed forces against 4 journalists, in particular, Ahmed Abu Hussein, Muath Amane, Yasser Mataja, and Nedal Ashteya, that resulted in the killing of Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Mataja, and the serious wounding of Muath Amane and Nedal Ashteya, who were both shot in the eye. Their cases are also the subject of a communication to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, submitted on the 19th of April 2022, 3 weeks before Shireen was killed, that calls upon the prosecutor to investigate these cases on the grounds that there are reasonable grounds to conclude that these shootings constitute war crimes, and the relevant domestic authorities, the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government, are either not willing or not able to investigate and prosecute these cases. In summary, Nedal Ashteya was shot in May 2015, whilst covering a demonstration, whilst covering a demonstration near the Hawara checkpoint near the northern West Bank city of Nablus. Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Mataja were shot and killed as they were covering the Great March of Return protests in 2018. Their cases were the subject of inquiry by the UN Commission of Inquiry on the protest in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the Commission found in both cases that the journalists did not pose an imminent threat of death or serious injury to the shooter, that the use of force was unlawful and was a violation of the journalist's right to life and the prohibition of targeting civilians under international humanitarian law, and that source of the shooting was an Israeli armed forces sniper. Muath Amane, a freelance journalist and photographer, was shot whilst covering protests by residents in Sarif village, northern Hebron, against plans by Israel to occupy land in order to construct the so-called security wall. Into 2019, Mr. Amane was shot in his left eye by a live round as he filmed from a distance a confrontation between the protesters and the Israeli forces. Rather disturbingly, the immediate aftermath of his shooting was filmed by members of the Israeli armed forces, who came right up to him with a video camera as he was being carried away by his fellow journalist to hospital. No offer of first aid, no offer to transport him to hospital, merely shoving a video camera in his face. It is not known what the purpose of this was. There has been, as far as we know, no internal inquiry, or at least if there has been, the results of that inquiry have not been released to Mr. Amane, and there's been no investigation into his shooting. These journalists, like Shireen, were all shot in circumstances where there are reasonable grounds to suspect war crimes have been committed. All were shot whilst doing their work as journalists covering protests and demonstrations in Palestine. All were wearing helmets and press vests, clearly identifiable as members of the press. All were standing at a distance from the so-called security fence and or the protests, and all were shot without warning. Now, the use of lethal force by the Israeli armed forces during the 2018 process met with widespread condemnation from the United Nations, governments and non-governmental organizations. The Commission of Inquiry, in its February 2019 report, concluded that Israeli snipers shot journalists intentionally, despite seeing that they were clearly marked as such. Yet, like Shireen, there has been no thorough, independent and impartial investigation into these incidents. This is despite the Commission of Inquiry clearly condemning the consistent failure by the government of Israel to comply with its obligations under international law to meaningfully investigate these and other cases where civilians have been killed or seriously injured as the result of the use of lethal force by members of the Israeli armed forces, and the failure to prosecute commanders and soldiers for crimes committed against Palestinians or to provide reparation to victims. The fact remains that in these circumstances, victims, including Shireen's family, are left to fight for an investigation. And this is unacceptable. Now, there are, of course, ways to access remedy via the civil courts. And in 2019, Adel Ashtea did seek a civil remedy in the Israeli domestic courts. And I mention this because it's an example of the obstacles to access to justice faced by victims of these kinds of acts. The defendant's case, it's recorded in the magistrate's court judgment, was quite concerningly that its Israeli forces were threatened by demonstrations, and this is what is concerning, and that Mr. Ashtea participated in one way or another in those demonstrations by virtue of the fact he was reporting on them. Now, the court dismissed the claim despite finding that it would have been possible to shoot him in the knee rather than in the eye, as if that would be a reasonable response to a journalist reporting on demonstrations, but dismissed the claim, holding that under the Torts Law State Liability Act, the state was immune from suit as the shooting occurred during a combat operation. Now, as stated in the judgment, the Torts Law State Liability Act defines combat operation as any operation fighting terror, hostile acts or rebellion, and also an operation to prevent terror, hostile acts or rebellion, is a combat-like operation. And by looking at its overall conditions, including the objective of the operation, its geographical location, or the threats to which the force carrying out the operation is facing. The court held that Mr. Ashtea was shot during a combat operation on the basis that photos had been produced in evidence that showed some masked men throwing stones. And its view that Nakba Day, the day on which he was shot, witnesses protests and clashes. Now, this broad application of the state immunity law that covers what is in essence law enforcement activities in the occupied territory presents an insurmountable obstacle to victims' access to justice in the domestic courts of Israel. So in the light of the lack of investigation and the lack of civil remedy or access to justice, what role can the International Criminal Court and international commissions of inquiry like yours and other international accountability mechanisms play, can and should play, in assuring accountability and justice to victims? Well, on the basis of the findings of the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner and the Palestinian Authority investigation, and these investigations carried out by media and civil society that include eyewitness evidence that you have heard today, in the course of these hearings from Shatta Anisha and Ali Samoudi, there are strong grounds to conclude that Shireen and Ali were shot by a member of the Israeli armed forces, and that the shots were directed towards them and were fired deliberately. These shootings took place in a situation of military occupation governed by international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and that sits within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. In these circumstances, there is a case to answer on the following allegations of Rome Statutes crimes. First, that Shireen's killing is unlawful and constitutes a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions and is a war crime of willful killing, contrary to Article 8(2)(a)(1) of the Rome Statute. Second, that the shooting and injury of Ali Samoudi was unlawful and constitutes a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions and a war crime of willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body and health, contrary to Article 8(2)(a)(3) of the Rome Statute. And third, that the act of firing live ammunition directed at the group of journalists constitutes a serious violation of the laws and customs applicable to international armed conflict, and the war crime of intentionally directing attacks against individual civilians not taking part in hostilities, contrary to Article 8(b)(1) of the Rome Statute. Now, further, there are reasonable grounds we submit to conclude that given the frequency of attacks against journalists in Palestine, commanders and other superiors of the Israeli forces and units operating in Palestine in particular knew or should have known that members of the Israeli forces were committing or about to commit the above crimes, and failed to take all necessary and reasonable measures within their power to prevent or repress their commission or submit the matter to the competent authorities for investigation and prosecution. And in the absence of investigation and access to justice in domestic fora, the victims and their families have sought remedy in the International Criminal Court and via the Human Rights Council special procedures that they hope will urge Israel to comply with its international obligations. And as I said previously, we've also submitted complaints on behalf of Nidal Ashtea, North Amane, Yasser Mataja, Ahmed Abu Hussein, and the occupants of the media towers to the UN special procedures mechanisms and to the International Criminal Court. Now, in our view, the UN special procedures role is important in the international human rights law framework in drawing attention to cases where there is no recourse to remedy in an international or regional human rights tribunal, and to providing some recognition for the violations of individual rights perpetrated by states, often with impunity. But it is with deep disappointment that I inform you that whereas the special rapporteurs forcefully condemned Shireen's killing and demanded a prompt, independent, impartial, effective, and thorough and transparent investigation in her case, action that is welcomed, the December 2020 complaints that were submitted on behalf of the other journalists before Shireen was killed have not been acted upon, as far as we're aware. Nevertheless, it is in these circumstances where victims and their families continue to suffer as a result of the failure or unwillingness of the relevant domestic authorities to cooperate in the investigation of Shireen's killing and the killing of many of other journalists in Palestine, that the international accountability mechanisms are key. But time and again, the Human Rights Council commissions of inquiry have condemned the unlawful use of force and condemned the killing and targeting of journalists in Palestine. Time and again, this condemnation has not translated into tangible justice for victims. The pre-trial chamber of the ICC on the 5th of February 2021 held that the court has jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute Rome Statute crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territories. Shireen's family, supported by PHJS, IFJ, and ICJP, have submitted a communication to the prosecutor that we would be happy to provide the Commission with, requesting that the prosecutor investigate the circumstances of her killing. It outlines why the domestic inquiries are not sufficient, why there's no prospect of thorough, independent investigation by Israel, and why Shireen's case is emblematic of the systematic targeting of journalists by members of Israeli armed forces who enjoy impunity for their acts. We are waiting for a substantive response to this request from the Office of the Prosecutor, and indeed to substantive response to the request by the families of Ahmed Abu Hussein and Yasser Mataja, and Nadal Ashtea and Wethamane and the occupants of the towers to the prosecutor to investigate those matters also. So to conclude, I focused my evidence on the lack of criminal investigation in Shireen's case and why there are grounds to suspect that war crimes have been committed in this case and why the ICC's mandate is engaged. I would like to impress upon the Commission of Inquiry the importance of action beyond condemnation alone. This is exactly the kind of situation where the International Criminal Court that the International Criminal Court was established to deal with, where the domestic authorities are either unwilling or unable to prosecute suspected Rome Statute crimes. And there is substantial material available upon which this suspicion in these cases is based. And it is available to the prosecutor, the families and the organisations that I represent are more than willing to cooperate with the Office of the Prosecutor and with the Commission of Inquiry in this regard. Victims cannot and should not be left to try and investigate these cases on their own, or left to rely on the goodwill and support of the media and civil society to investigate their cases. The threats to journalists working in Palestine are ongoing, as you've heard, and the responsibility to investigate and to ensure accountability rests primarily on the shoulders of the domestic authorities. But in the absence of any prospect of investigation there, that responsibility now rests on the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eatwell, for that very comprehensive introduction to the accountability exercise. We'd like to ask a few questions if we could.
Yeah.
Could I also ask whether you have sent that paper as a paper to us, because it would be very useful for us to have that in written form as well.
You mean the notes like this, my speaking notes from today?
You were speaking very fluently.
I was going to suggest that we might provide you with our communications to the Office of the Prosecutor, to the ICC, that provides the international legal frameworks and sort of further detail of further summaries of the evidence that we have been able to gather ourselves. Would that be helpful?
Yes, it would. Thank you.
Okay.
That'd be good if you could do that. In the first part where you were talking about the investigations by civil society and media, you summarised 6 points that you indicate are common across them. And there was one that seems to me that is at the crux of the situation, where you said that point 3 was that the shots were fired deliberately. Fired deliberately is not the same as fired deliberately with intention to kill or maim. How did these inquiries move between or did they go as far as saying that it was intentional as well as deliberate? And if so, what did they conclude was the intent that was, in their view, established?
I'd have to double check on the detail of it, but I think the crux of the summary of the conclusions were that they were deliberate. I think without a proper criminal investigation, where the marksman, suspected marksman, is interviewed, one cannot establish intention of the person doing the shooting. Nevertheless, with respect to the way in which the bullets, the trajectory of the bullets and the manner in which they were shot, sort of clear, pronounced single shots, targeted at a small area. You can see you may have seen photographic evidence of the marks that the shots made on the tree. Then that is clearly that they were fired deliberately. What can be implied from the findings that Shireen would have been visible as a journalist was that they were deliberately fired at someone who was visible as a journalist, and that firing live ammunition at a civilian, it is virtually certain that that would cause harm. And that's what needs to be shown under the Rome Statute. Is it virtually certain that this will cause seriously injury and harm? Firing live ammunition at a person, it is virtually certain, in that manner, it is virtually certain. And I think what is deeply concerning about the circumstances of Shireen's shooting is that the firing continued. It would have been quite clear that one civilian had been shot and was running away. It would have been quite clear that another journalist had been hit and fallen to the floor, and that Shatta was there, absolutely terrified, with just a small tree trunk to hide behind, and was being continually shot at. Now, even if in the crux of a sort of immediate moment, one does not see that they are journalists, one would have seen, it's virtually certain that the shooter would have seen that they were journalists and marked as press as the shooting continued. And I think from that is sufficient to raise, and that all that needs to be raised at this moment is the reasonable suspicion of a crime being committed or a violation of international humanitarian law. And that needs to be properly investigated. And that's what the victims and their families are calling for. It's a proper criminal investigation into this. And then, prosecution, then it's for a criminal court to determine.
What was the period between the first shot and the sixth?
I'll have to check my records on that. I think it was a very small period of time. It was over a matter of 1 or 2 minutes, if that. It was a very short.
But they were fired as individual shots, it is considered, rather than as a fusillade, if you like, or a machine gun.
No, exactly. It was not. It was the audio recordings. You can hear cracks of fire, but not sort of rapid fire. So it's cracks of individual shots fired several seconds apart.
Thank you. Just on the forensic examination undertaken by the Israeli Defence Forces, was that I know it was conducted by the IDF, but was it conducted by civilian or military personnel? Is that known?
I don't know if the IDF conducted a forensic examination. Their inquiry said, or what it entailed. Their inquiry report said that they did have a forensic examination, that they interviewed eyewitnesses and members of the IDF involved, but no further detail was given. So as far as we are aware, the inquiry conducted by the IDF is wholly internal and conducted by their own personnel and not civilian personnel.
Thank you. Have you received any feedback from the International Criminal Court Prosecutor's Office as to their response to the submissions that have been made?
No, regrettably not yet. We hope to.
We'd be grateful if you could advise us, if you're free to do so, when you receive a response and the nature of the response.
Yeah, be happy to.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good afternoon, Ms. Eatwell. I had a couple of questions. In the investigations that have been carried out, you listed them, and we know Washington Post, New York Times, Bellingcat, Al-Haq, Forensic Architecture, OHCHR. Did you find any discrepancies at all, or do they all reach exactly the same conclusions? And if you found any differences or any kind of inconsistencies, would you be able to tell us?
They all reach very similar conclusions on the principal points about the looking at the footage released by the Israeli Foreign Ministry on the morning that Shireen was killed, that stated it was likely that the Palestinian gunman in that footage was the source of her shooting. They all conclude that that gunman in the footage was located, that the Israeli armed forces were actually located between that gunman and Shireen, and that the gunman was in a side street and would have been shooting down a very narrow alleyway that was nowhere near Shireen. Indeed, it would have been quite impossible. I think it was something like up to 300 meters away from Shireen's location. So they all made that same conclusion about the location. They all came draw the same conclusion about the direction of the shots and the source of the shots that were fired at her. But again, I cannot stress too strongly, forcefully, that whereas these investigations are really useful, and of course are a great use to the Commission of Inquiry and a great use to us and everyone involved, and really do shine a light on the situation, they are no substitute for a proper forensic investigation. And so I would say that they're important. They are important, but they're not sufficient for the family.
And you mentioned the importance of identifying the gunmen and the commanders who possibly gave the order. Do you know of any process underway for that? Are there any sort of suggested names or any indication of, who could have been the person or persons who gave such orders? If as everyone's saying, if it's targeted killing.
So as I'm sure you appreciate, getting that kind of information is very difficult for a civilian and for someone who is not a state actor or say, part of a commission of inquiry, or indeed the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC. But of course, command responsibility isn't simply founded on the basis of giving of an order, but on the failure where risk is foreseeable to prevent unlawful acts being committed by one's subordinates. I would say that it is likely possible to identify the unit and the commander of that unit and to go from there. Unfortunately, I'm not able to provide that information to you today.
Okay, and you've stated that there's obviously a colossal responsibility on the ICC now, and you mentioned on the COI, on our COI. Would you be able to say what is it that, from our mandate and your expectations, what is it that we can do that would be, let's say, separate from, obviously, whatever we do will go to the ICC, but separately from the ICC, is there something we can do in this case?
Well, I think the Commission of Inquiry, the fact that you are holding these public hearings is incredibly important. And providing a record of testimony and allowing victims and the families of victims their voice is incredibly important. But in many of these cases that I act in, there's often a frustration amongst victims that the violations of their rights and the crimes or alleged crimes committed against them and their family members are condemned internationally and by important bodies of your own, such as your own, but that doesn't translate into anything tangible. Now, of course, it's hard, it's difficult, but we don't give up on the basis that things are hard and difficult. And I think the Commission of Inquiry is well placed to seek dialogue with the relevant domestic authorities, with the Palestinian Authority and with the Israeli government. Because in these matters, ultimately, as I said, that there is a lack of trust with respect to the ability or willingness of the Israeli authorities to conduct an investigation. And that is only damaging, in my view, to the interests of the domestic authorities involved. And it is through dialogue that these things can change. But ultimately, I know that the Commission of Inquiry has a restricted mandate, but gathering the evidence that is available, speaking with victims, hearing their voices, and being in dialogue also with the International Criminal Court can only be of benefit. But ultimately, what the victims want to see is justice and accountability, wherever that may lie. And wherever that may occur in these circumstances and in the intractable situation that they face. It is to you and to the International Criminal Court that they look.
Thanks very much, Ms. Eatwell, for your important work and the bodies you represent.
Could I just go back to one issue, and that is the question of command. Do you know anything about the operational procedures of the IDF as to whether in a case like this, an individual soldier would have discretion to fire or would need to seek higher instructions to do so?
I'm afraid you would have to get evidence from an expert on the operational procedures of the IDF. That falls outside my area of expertise. What I do know is that sort of formally, officially, rules of engagement that have been published by the IDF prohibit firing directly at civilians and the use of lethal force against civilians unless absolutely necessary. Of course, the written rules of engagement are written in accordance with international humanitarian law. However, what we are seeing is that the practice is very different to that. And even if there were no, even if there were a requirement for an order, then and the snipers or marksmen were shooting civilians outside of their orders, there is a pattern of conduct here that needs to be addressed, and the failure to address it just perpetuates a situation of impunity where journalists are considered fair game. I think it's deeply concerning, the comments made, maybe off the cuff, maybe deliberately, that journalists are armed with cameras, that they are somehow participating with demonstrators whose stones seem to threaten Israeli armed forces and are referred to as justification for use of lethal force. I think the failure to distinguish between civilians and persons participating in the hostilities is of great concern. So whatever is written in terms of the rules of engagement, the practice is what needs to be focused on.
Thanks very much. That is an issue that we do need to follow up, as you indicated, but it's very difficult to find information, so I can understand your answer. Dr. Eatwell, thank you very much for your assistance. It would be much appreciated if you could forward to us that ICC submission and any other material that comes your way that you would think might be helpful to our inquiries. We do need to cover much the same ground as you in some respects, and so it would be helpful for us to have access to that.
We will do so, and just to say thank you for inviting me to give evidence to you today on behalf of those that I represent. It's been certainly a privilege to give evidence to you, and I wish you every success with your inquiry.
Thank you very much. The testimony given by Dr. Eatwell concludes this set of public hearings of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. These public hearings this week have been the first undertaken by this Commission of Inquiry, but I don't think they'll be the last. They have focused on the designation of terrorism or unlawfulness and closure orders issued against a number of Palestinian non-government organisations, and on the incident surrounding the killing of the journalist Shireen Abu Akleh and wounding of her colleague and attempted shooting of another. The Commission expresses its appreciation and thanks to representatives of civil society organisations, witnesses and particularly victims who agreed to participate in these hearings and share their experiences with us and through the UN TV service with the world, sometimes reliving highly traumatic events. We have heard their testimony on a number of issues, and we will be investigating those issues further. We have heard statements from representatives of all 7 of the civil society organisations that were the subject of orders relating to terrorism or illegality and orders to close. We have heard that those orders were motivated by an intent to silence their work, documenting human rights violations and advocating for accountability, rather than based on any credible evidence of unlawful activities. We have heard accounts of threats received by individual staff members. We have heard testimony that a number of separate organisations have engaged in concerted efforts to slander and silence prominent Palestinian and Israeli human rights organisations. We have heard allegations on restrictions of freedoms of expression association by the Palestinian Authority and the de facto authorities in Gaza, including at least one case resulting in death in detention. We have heard allegations about women human rights defenders being intentionally targeted by both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, receiving threats to discourage them individually and collectively from pursuing their work. We have heard testimony on the targeting of journalists, both Palestinian and international, and allegations that this was intentional and systematic. We have heard testimony from eyewitnesses and survivors that Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was intentionally killed by elements of the Israeli security forces, and from the family, and now one of their legal representatives, that to date no credible accountability efforts have been undertaken. These are things that we have heard, but on which at this stage we have formed no conclusions of our own. These hearings are the first step in our investigation into violations and abuses of the rights to freedom of expression and association. We stress that we will not, at this stage, make any findings or recommendations based on what we have heard during these hearings. The testimonies provided will be reviewed. They will be analysed in line with the Commission's mandate, evidentiary standards and methods of work. We acknowledge that we were only able to hear from a limited number of persons. We will therefore investigate more widely and more fully the allegations that have been made and seek to obtain more information and evidence on them. We may also decide to undertake further hearings at a later stage as our investigation progresses. We take this opportunity to note that we have called for submissions regarding specific alleged violations and abuses in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and in Israel. This invitation was published on our website, and we invite individuals, groups and organisations to submit relevant information or evidence, both on matters covered in these hearings and more broadly on restriction of civil society space in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. We also call on states to provide any information or evidence they have on the topics covered in these hearings, that is, the designations of the non-government organisations and the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. In closing these hearings, we thank again all those who have appeared and cooperated with the processes of this Commission. We call on those that have not cooperated to date to do so, particularly states that have information at their disposal. We will continue our investigation, forming our conclusions, undertaking our analysis and developing recommendations. Our next report will be provided to the Human Rights Council at its June session in 2023. We have a lot to do between now and then. Thank you very much. These hearings are closed.